If you've ever played any first-person shooter before, you know some mechanics are universal, or at least well-established, normally done so by some older game, usually Doom, Quake, or Wolfenstein 3D. But who do you have to thank for these games and their legacies? Well, I think most of us know them, but let's shine some more light on them. Let's talk about id Software. Its start wasn't with the start of the company. At first, John Carmack, John Romero, and Tom Hall worked for a company called Softdisk and developed games for them every month. However, they formed a smaller group that was referred to as Ideas from the Deep. The group's first major project started with the discovery that John Carmack had made during one late night. He was able to pull off smooth scrolling on the PC, which hadn't been done before since PCs didn't have the power to pull it off. But Carmack had pulled it off and made a demo called Dangerous Dave in copyright infringement, which had the character of Dangerous Dave inside the first level of Super Mario Bros. 3. Carmack left the demo on the desk of John Romero, who was impressed and saw the potential, which eventually led the Ideas from the Deep, or IFD team, to develop a longer demo of Mario 3, which they eventually sent off to Nintendo. According to Romero, Nintendo saw the demo and thought it was impressive. However, Nintendo was only interested in having their own intellectual property on their own hardware, so they couldn't move forward with the project. But around the same time, Scott Miller of Apogee Software learned about the group by playing one of the Softdisk games that John Romero had made, that game being Pyramids of Egypt. He noticed the group's talent and started mailing fan letters. These letters were attempts by Scott Miller to hire the IFD team, and specifically Romero, with the letters having a number and contact information of Scott Miller so they could get in touch with him. However, Softdisk had a policy of no business within fan letters. So, Scott Miller made these fake fan letters and included his contact at the bottom, however with each different letter having a different name. Originally, the IFD team and Romero thought they were just fan letters, so they didn't really care for the contact information at the bottom. However, the Ideas from the Deep team noticed that they were all the same addressed after a while. So IFD confronted Miller, and Miller explained he did that because Softdisk green letters it got. Although Romero and other Softdisk developers were disappointed in not receiving real fan mail, they did propose ideas of games to Miller that could be released via Apogee. Apogee used a software model called the Apogee model. This is where a fraction of a game was free to play, while the rest of the game had to be bought. One of the earliest games the IFD team made for Apogee under the shareware model to be released to the public was Commander Keen. It was a side-scrolling platformer released in December of 1990. It was successful, and according to John Romero, successful enough that once the Ideas from the Deep team got their first royalty check, Romero, John Carmack, and Adrian Carmack decided to start their own company. However, before the company formed, they got Tom Hall on board with the idea and continued working on the Commander Keen series. Then on February 1st, 1991, both Carmacks, Romero, and Hall founded the new company, id Software. They came up with the name due to opting to drop the F from IFD, leaving us with id Software. It worked on 12 games within their first year, working on 2 games at the same time, with each game being released within 2 months of development. Additionally, it moved from Louisiana to Wisconsin in August of 1991. After the move, the team at id Software started working on a new game, which would later become known as Wolfenstein 3D. The idea for the game originated from John Romero when he suggested that the team should remake Castle Wolfenstein, which was made originally by Muse Software in 1981. The original Wolfenstein was a shooter where the player played as a character trying to escape a German castle and Nazis. This idea of remaking Castle Wolfenstein was the idea that id decided to go with. They had work to do, however, most of it expanding on their work from previous titles, specifically expanding on the graphics of Hover Tank 3D and Catacomb 3D, both of which were 3D shooters that the id members had made. But before they could even begin working on the game, they needed the rights to Wolfenstein. The team came up with other possible names, but they luckily found out that Muse Software had gone defunct in 1987, and the rights were owned by someone in Michigan. Once id found out, they bought the rights to Wolfenstein and continued with the name Wolfenstein 3D, which started development on December 15th, 1991. John Romero and Tom Hall designed the gameplay and aesthetics. Romero also did the general storyline, and he also programmed the game with John Carmack. John Carmack also created the 3D technology for the game. Adrian Carmack did the art, and Robert Prince composed. They also hired Kevin Cloud as an assistant. Cloud worked at Softdisk as an editorial director and as an informal liaison between id and Softdisk. Following the hire of Kevin Cloud, id decided to move to Texas, closer to Apogee, which was seen positively by Scott Miller, who subsequently increased their royalty rate up to 50%. However, as the game was nearing completion, FormGen, who had agreed to publish a Wolfenstein game in retail, contacted id concerning the violence and shocking content of the game. So what did id do? Well, they turned up the violence and shocking content in response. Then, before the game was released, id went through a month of playtesting, and finally, the game was released on Apogee on May 5th, 1992, and the retail version of Wolfenstein, titled Spear of Destiny, was released on September 18th, 1992. The game sold really well, with id making $100,000 United States dollars from their first royalty check from Apogee a month after release, outselling all of id's previous games in the process. It wasn't just popular in the US, however. The game made its way to other countries where it gained popularity. For example, the game was very popular in Germany. However, the game ended up being banned in Germany pretty soon. It was very popular and caught the eyes of German authorities fast. The reason for the ban was that Germany after World War II had banned the use of Nazi symbols and Nazi-like imagery in entertainment. However, even though it couldn't be sold in Germany, it continued being distributed through bulletin board systems, or BBS boards, and got a secret codename by German players, Hundertfelsen 4C. Wolfenstein was just popular enough that even with a ban, people continued playing it. And that wasn't the end of id's success with Wolfenstein. The Wolfenstein 3D engine was very advanced for the time, and many companies wanted to license the engine, which id decided to do, providing them with a further income and starting a trend of providing their future engines via licensing. Additionally, it ported the game to other platforms like the SNES and Atari Jaguar, further expanding the availability and revenue from Wolfenstein. With Wolfenstein 3D being a major success, id decided to start development on a new first-person shooter. They considered doing a licensed game on the film Aliens, but dropped the idea to retain creative freedom. Id ultimately decided to go with a demonic tone for the game due to a Dungeons & Dragons campaign the team had gone through. The idea of the game was liked by all at id, and John Carmack came up with the name for the game. After a line from the film, The Color of Money.
What you got in there? In here? Doom.
Tom Hall started writing an outline for the whole game, including a story and game features. This would later become known as the Doom Bible, and he would finish writing it by November 28, 1992. The id software team would go through everything they wanted before development. Hall wanted level-by-level progression, similar to what they had done in Wolfenstein. Meanwhile, John Carmack wanted just one giant level, which was developed. However, within a month, it decided to go with a level-by-level progression. Furthermore, most of the ideas within the Doom Bible were dropped or never implemented, mainly since Carmack didn't want to focus on a narrative, but rather gameplay, with Carmack saying, quote, "Story in a game is like story in a porn film. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important." Nonetheless, they continued development, and in January 1993, they made a press release that included the features of Doom. Additionally, pre-beta versions of the game came out, and the game was supposed to come out in the third quarter of 1993. At face value, things seemed great for id, on the outside at least. But on the inside of id, everything wasn't completely great. The team had many disputes about the design for the game. Normally, the disputes were between Tom Hall and John Carmack. Additionally, Hall felt isolated. Most of his ideas for the game weren't being followed or had never even gone through. And other members of id felt that things weren't working between them and Hall. So in August of 1993, Tom Hall left id Software and went to work for Apogee. Additionally, id had to delay the game after missing the original third quarter release date. Following the departure of Tom Hall, id hired two new developers in September of 1993, Dave Taylor and Sandy Peterson. Taylor was a programmer and Peterson was a designer. Then id continued work on development, primarily redesigning levels and adding multiplayer and deathmatch. Development neared completion in late November and/or early December. The team worked for 30 hours straight before its completion. Then, at midnight on the 10th of December 1993, they started uploading the first episode of the game on the internet via the University of Wisconsin-Madison's file transfer protocol server. However, so many people were connected to the server that the network administrator had to kick all other users off so it could upload the game. The game finished uploading 30 minutes later, and 10,000 people attempted to download the game at once, which resulted in a crash of the network again. However, with that, Doom was finally out in the world. Doom's reception was amazing. Although the game was not true 3D and it had missed its original deadline, it was regarded as worth the wait. With graphics that brought a new level of detail and immersion that eventually led to the phrase, "Can it run Doom?" And with fast, fun, and violent gameplay to back it up. Gaming had changed forever. Any first-person shooter following Doom's release was then known as a Doom clone. And Doom sales certainly backed this up. Millions installed the shareware version of the game. And according to PC Date, Doom made about $8 million by 1998. Of course, with sales like these, a sequel to Doom came out in October of 1994, which was about just as successful. It was pretty much the same as the original Doom, but with new maps. However, it still had more games to come. They worked on Heretic for Raven Software in 1994, and also worked on the game's sequel, Hexen, Beyond Heretic, in 1995. However, these weren't proper id games, but the next proper id game was coming soon. The next proper game from id would be a proper 3D game, and luckily for id, they had set some groundwork for this new game back in 1990. Via id's D&D sessions, they had a character called Quake, who had a Thor-like hammer, and the id team wanted to make a game based around him. So within a preview section of the first Commander Keen game, they had teased the idea of id's then possible next new game called Quake: The Fight for Justice. It did work on this possible game within a couple of weeks in January of 1991, but due to the weak technology of the time, The game was not meeting the expectation of the team, so id put the project on hold. However, around 1994, John Carmack was working on the next engine for id, this time with true 3D. Additionally, some ideas for the game were being developed. An early one being that Quake, the character, acting like Thor, and having the game take place in the medieval period. This was a start, but they still needed a 3D level editor, which John Carmack was developing, called QuakeEd. However, QuakeEd still needed time to be developed. So in the meantime, the team designed the levels, with John Romero doing it on paper. Furthermore, in 1995, id needed more programming help. So id brought on Michael Abrash. Abrash wrote the book Power Graphic Programming, which taught John Carmack how to create graphics for the original Commander Keen. And Abrash also wrote in Dr. Dobbs' journal, teaching the 8086 assembly language. However, Abrash was then working at Microsoft, so Carmack went over to Seattle, Washington, where Microsoft headquarters were located, and convinced Michael to join the id team in Texas. Unfortunately for id, the first half of 1995 was very busy for them. John Romero taught Sandy Peterson and American McGee, who was another game designer at id, how to make levels with QuakeEd. It also had to get Abrash situated, work on Hexen Beyond Heretic, and worked on a full retail release of Doom called The Ultimate Doom. Furthermore, they had to research methods for creating 3D models with animation, and also get hardware that could do it fast and easily. Luckily, Carmack was able to figure out how to read 3D models and textures, and id found Indigo workstations and modeling software. Furthermore, id figured out who was going to deal with the 3D models and their textures. Kevin Cloud decided to make the 3D models, and Adrian Carmack would do the textures and everything else that was 2D. After that, the id team finished up the engine to a point where they could start working. Unfortunately, half of the team was pretty burned out and wanted to finish levels and make the game a first-person shooter and ship it out, with the other half wanting to do design experimentation. However, with the shape of the team, they couldn't do much besides make it a first-person shooter and get it done as fast as possible. During development, they found out that 9 Inch Nails were big fans of Doom, so id got in contact with Trent Reznor and discussed him making the soundtrack, which he agreed on. They continued development, however, the atmosphere at id was silent around January of 1996. With everyone doing what they needed to do and working to get the game out, and by February of 1996, the game was ready to be tested. They got local Doom players to test it and get their feedback. With their feedback, they continued with the game. However, the end of the game's development was intense. In fact, according to John Romero, American McGee was sick for the last month of development, and they only saw him a couple weeks after the game was released, which left other developers to finish up the levels, and Romero dealt with the audio, including the 9 Inch Nails soundtrack, which he had recently got. Once that was over, the game was uploaded online on July 22nd, 1996. And with it, Quake was out. Quake, just like most of id's games, was received amazingly, even if it was somewhat overhyped. It had an advanced 3D engine for the time, great sound effects, great atmospheric music, and great multiplayer. With Wolfenstein, the popularity of FPS games was born. With Doom, the quality of the games were increased, and that popularity grew even bigger. And Quake? Well, let's just say it multiplied what Doom did by a lot. However, even with the amazing reception, it was not in a good state. Financially, it was great, but the people at id were recuperating within the month following Quake's release, with John Romero taking a 2-week break, then returning to work on the physical distribution of Quake, and after that, Romero left id. Romero had talked to Tom Hall about making a new company after Quake while he was still working on the game, which is what he did. As for id, the company, it continued, but it wasn't the same. Quake called an end to the classic lineup of id. After Quake, no new franchises were made, only a continuation of what they already had done, releasing games like Quake 2, Doom 3, Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and more recently, new Doom and Wolfenstein games. Furthermore, many people who had worked on Quake or any of the id titles before it had left id. id was the titan of early PC gaming and early FPS shooter scenes. Their work can't be overlooked, even today. And even with the company dividing after Quake, you can't help but look in awe at the legacy of the classic period of id Software, which left us with so many classics.